Welcome everybody to the Coastal Adaptation over Space and Time Seacoast activity we call Disciplines 101. This is where researchers from a broad range of disciplines take turns teaching each other about the basics of our disciplinary perspectives and methods in the context of coastal processes and issues. And we, as a quick looking forward to 2 weeks from today, let me jump to a PowerPoint if I can, which is, okay, there we go. So in 2 weeks, we'll have one of our lessons from Kathy Dello, who's the state climatologist for North Carolina. And she'll talk about climate change in the specific context of North Carolina. And usually we have 2 lessons and discussion following each in each Disciplines 101 session. Next week, we will have 1 lesson from Kathy, and then we'll use the other half of that session for a discussion that we can use to synthesize some of the different perspectives that we'd seen from researchers over the course of this academic year. This is something that will continue a bunch more. We're going to continue Disciplines 101 into next fall semester, next academic year, and we will start having more of these synthetic discussions. So this is just the beginning of our opportunities to really start to ask each other more questions than we can in the format we've had so far. And any discussion is good, but we're going to just seed the discussion with a couple of specific foci. That one of them has to do with the dynamics of flooding in the environments behind the barriers, the estuaries and the riverine floodplain environments, where since we know that what humans do affects flooding a lot, and of course what happens with the floods affects humans a lot and affects their decisions. I'm going to focus on the questions that boil down to what can social scientists and physical scientists or natural scientists and practitioners learn from each other about a couple of particular points. Again, we don't want to limit discussion, but just to seed things with that point, and then with a really parallel handful of questions regarding open ocean shoreline environments, where the questions are analogous but somewhat different. And rather than read those at this point, we will post those, but just wanted to give everybody a heads up to look forward to the next session. And for today, our pair of lessons going to come from, so Catherine and Nardi is going to give our second lesson, and the first one is going to be a joint effort of Eli Lazarus and Evan Goldstein. Eli is at the University of Southampton and Evan at UNC Greensboro. They both have backgrounds in geomorphology, coastal geomorphology, but geomorphology more broadly. And Eli these days studies natural and anthropogenic processes of physical change in coastal and terrestrial environments. And Evan, while being a coastal geomorphologist, focuses on machine learning, or to some degree on machine learning, coupled human landscape systems, and open science. And I'll turn it over to you guys to take it away. So we'll do something like a 20-minute presentation lesson from Evan and Eli, and then we'll follow it with 10 or so minutes of discussion. For the questions, for discussion questions or discussion points, you can either just enter those in the chat to everybody, and then Marty Smith will preside over the question session, or if you'd rather, you can send them as a private chat to Marty, and Marty can read your question or comment out at that point. So over to you guys.
Okay, awesome. Thanks very much for having us speak. And I assume everybody can hear, but just let me know, or see, let me know if there's a problem. This talk is really just Eli and I mulling over publicly, I guess, what we think about and what we talk about when we are thinking about storm impacts and development, when we say those words. So Eli, as Brad said, is from University of Southampton, and I'm from UNC Greensboro, right down the road. So here's our details if you want to get in touch with us. And before we start, I just wanted to acknowledge that the land I'm on here in Greensboro, at UNC Greensboro in my house, has long served as the site of meeting and exchange amongst a number of Indigenous peoples, specifically the Kiawe and the Sara. And we're going to be talking about storm impacts all along the East and Gulf Coast, which has has served as the site of meeting and exchange and life for a number of different Indigenous peoples. So you can see all that from this native lands map. And also, it wouldn't be right for Eli and I to be talking about this and claiming all the credit. We have a huge list of great collaborators that we've worked with who have sparked discussion, helped with actual analysis, helped with data collection, and done a huge amount of the work with us in tandem. So I just wanted to put all their names and acknowledge them, let alone all the people behind the scenes, like our families who enable us to do the work and be here today and be talking to you. So thanks to everybody. And we just want to acknowledge our funders who have provided us with a lot of support to be able to do this work. So thanks, really thanks to everybody, even all of you. So after every big storm that hits the US East and Gulf Coast, Eli and I often are messaging each other and talking about when the NOAA emergency response imagery is going to be posted. And this is imagery that NOAA National Geodetic Survey flies after storm events when it's safe and takes pictures of the whole entire coast. So synoptic aerial imagery. This stuff is really interesting to see what the impacts of the storm are, both from a natural system, seeing where all the sand moves, and from a coupled human natural system, seeing what the destruction of the storm has been over huge spatial extents. So I'm very grateful that NOAA takes all of these images because they're quite impressive to look at and give scientists a lot of things to talk about. They show incalculable destruction, but to lives and livelihood, but they also give us a lot to speak about and to think about. So this is an example of Surf City after Hurricane Florence in 2018, and it was taken September 18th, so just a few days after the storm event. And you can see from this image, what I see as a geomorphologist is a broad sheet of sand between homes that has been deposited, that has moved from the underwater or from the beach system onto the top of the barrier island. We call this washover. It forms from the process of overwash. So water bringing sand from in front of the dune, the beach, over on top. And that's really one of the key things that we want to focus on for this talk, is this washover deposit. So when we look at this, we always ask the same questions about it as geomorphologists. How much sand is that? Look at the patterns. What sets the size, shape, and scaling of the patterns, and how the buildings and sand movement and deposition processes all interact with each other. So why does this look the way that it does? Why does the sand look the way that it does in between this or interacting with this pattern, with this urban pattern? So these are the sorts of questions that we ask when we look at these sorts of images. And I think as geomorphologists, it's important for me to convey to all of you why we even care about washover deposits. They're beautiful in terms of a pattern sense, self-organized pattern formation process. You can see on the left, here are a bunch of examples of natural washover patterns, and they're along shore extent. So they form these arcuate lode patterns. And washover itself is the mechanism by which coastal barriers maintain their size, shape, with elevation relative to sea level. So this is how barrier islands grow in elevation to keep pace with sea level rise, and how they migrate backwards as sea level rise processes, as sea level rise and the processes associated with storms and sea level rise occur. And from a human perspective, I care about it because it requires cleanup, which is money. So a lot of bulldozers or heavy equipment is often required whenever these washover deposits occur in built settings. We need to scrape the sand away from the road so that emergency responders can come in and make sure everybody's okay, assess property damages and loss of life, and also for power companies to come in and get power operational. So it's important to clear away this sand so to gain access to places that have been impacted. So washover budgets and patterns are also fascinating to us in built settings too, because the patterns look so different. Here's an example from Nelson and LeClaire looking at deposits from a breached levee in Hurricane Katrina on the left. And you can see the map view with the buildings and the streets, and then the pink is the sandy deposits that have wound their way through the streets and neighborhoods and into the parks and deposited. These look very different from those lobe-shaped patterns that we saw in the previous slide. And it's my belief that this is a geomorphic phenomena that we don't know a ton about. And it's because the deposits themselves are cleared away very rapidly for emergency response reasons. So they're inherently ephemeral. And it's our belief that these are expensive over time to clean up with. I've looked into trying to find the budget, how much money is required to clean these things up. And it's often entangled with just the line item in FEMA for debris. So it's unclear how much is sand and how much is built debris and shrubbery and things like that. But we believe that just the act of getting people there and clearing away, scraping away the built, all of the stuff in the built setting is expensive and will add up over time. And I think that these washover deposits in built settings are going to become more likely as development increases. You can see on the left metrics about house size at the coast increasing through time. And we all have our own personal stories of seeing places built up over time along the entire coastline and coastal counties and the east and Gulf Coast of the US. Here's an example from Harvey Cedars, New Jersey, from Jackson and Nordstrom, showing successive images from 1961 all the way to the present of the built up of the environment being slowly built up through time along these barrier islands. So even holding storms constant, we expect it to be these washover deposits in built settings to be more likely, let alone with the increases in frequency and magnitude that are expected. So in general, that sort of sets up a question that Eli and I are very interested in as geomorphologists, which is how do washover deposits and coastal development interact over short time scales, a storm, a single deposit that's forming, and over long time scales? How does the built setting actually respond, or what are the feedbacks that are involved in the built setting responding to it being periodically inundated with sand in situations or periodic destruction occurring? So these are questions we're going to discuss through this, how we're thinking about these problems, primarily by going out and measuring stuff, by taking our rulers out in the field and actually laying it down and walking through and measuring things. So I'll kick it over to Eli.
Thanks, Evan. Evan and I were both inspired by this recent book. It came from Jeffrey West, an incredible treatise really called Scale. And the reason it's so amazing is because the fundamental premise of Scale, and this is a truly sort of transdisciplinary finding or approach. It comes out of it's seen most in physics and ecology, I think, in the way that West sort of employs it. But the idea of scale is essentially that the components of a particular feature in ecology, it's an organism, or in geomorphology, it's an individual landform. Like in this case, in the center of this image, we have a single washover deposit. But the idea is that the internal characteristics, the intrinsic characteristics of these features or an animal scale with respect to each other. So this is, in this case, one of the famous examples had to do with sort of the size of a fiddler crab claw. And in our case, we were looking at what are the simplest geometric characteristics of of a washover deposit that we can look at. And one of the reasons we're interested in just the sort of 2D features, two-dimensional features, is because often, as in the NOAA imagery, often 2 dimensions is all we've got. While everybody would love 3-dimensional data forever and always, the availability of 3-dimensional data is still just over the technological horizon in most places, but you can get aerial imagery. And so you can actually get a lot from aerial imagery. So in this case, among the things that we think about a lot when we look at these features from the air, we can calculate just on the basis of a polygon. If you trace these features out, you can see the area, you can get the length, you can get the width, which is not labeled in this case. You can calculate the perimeter of this polygon. And some of the work that sort of precipitated a lot of this was that if you look at these deposits, if you look at a lot of these deposits all over the world from different storms and different settings and different contexts, they actually scale. The internal geometric characteristics of these features scale in a very clean, well-organized way, and they scale at sort of, they scale all the way up to deposits you can find on Mars, not necessarily washover, but sort of mass transport deposits, all the way down to sort of very small scale physical experiments that you can do basically in your kitchen sink. Kick us ahead there. There we go. So one of the things that we wanted to test for built settings was, you know, when coastal geomorphologists especially look for a feature to examine, they tend to look for non-built, they look for environments that are free of people. They want no human influence in the picture. They go for sort of the pristine if they can find it, and the literature is full of that. And one of the things that we were interested in doing was getting outside of that, and it puts us automatically into a completely different context. But the question was, does washover scaling, in this case on the left we've got area versus, or a plot of length versus area, which is sort of a canonical scaling law. These are all deposits. Does the scaling of features in built environments, how does that compare to features that we're very familiar with in unbuilt environments? And depending on how we look at them, you know, like in this case, length versus area, those relationships, those intrinsic relationships hold. We can sort of see very much an overlap of, you know, a deposit in an unbuilt setting looks a lot like a deposit in a built setting under, you know, when you look at certain geometric characteristics, but not when you look at others. So, you know, if you actually look at these images, you can see, and, you know, Evan showed us the Nelson and LeClaire deposit from New Orleans. You know, if you look in the NOAA imagery, you can see these incredibly ornate deposits all through built environments. Some of them are very sparse and they look a lot like a deposit on an unbuilt environment. Some of them are very dense in some of these incredibly built up parts of New Jersey, for example. And as you look across that spectrum, we can find where in that transition, the scaling, in this case, if you look at perimeter, you look at the shape of these features, that scaling begins to break. And we were very interested in that break. When do these features change in such a way that they look fundamentally and quantitatively different from the features we can find in their sort of unbuilt counterparts? So to go back over to Evan in this case, we did this manually, and Evan, one of the things Evan likes to say is he hates clicking. Evan hates clicking, and so we wanted, you know, Evan's big push recently has been to turn this whole conceptual approach over to a more automated way of extracting data from these images.
Yeah, so I don't like to click. So the question is, can we do this at scale? And there are a few fundamental issues that were technical hurdles that we needed to overcome. First is that the Hurricane Florence images there are 29,000 images and they're each 7.7 megabytes. And So it's a lot. It's heavy in terms of the amount of files and the weight of each file. And the sensors on NOAA are upgraded every single year on the airplanes, are upgraded every single year. So this is 2018 data. The sensor has only gotten better through time. And because of amazing efforts with the USGS and NOAA in tandem, they take more images so that there's more overlap for stereo work. But in general, if we look at the entire catalog of images, there are 134,000 images across 10 storms. So finding and tracing deposits manually is just not feasible. So one way of dealing with this is trying to get our computers to do a lot of the tracing work for us. So when we look at these deposits, we see them, they're features that we can trace and understand. So a traditional programmatic way of dealing with that is taking the data and writing a computer program that would trace these images out for us. So we'd have to come up with a bunch of ad hoc rules. We'd say, okay, if you see light material next to dark material, then maybe draw a line. And we try to segment or parse the image into what pixel is sand and what pixel is building. So that's a traditional way of doing it. You would write a program, you'd give the data, the image in this case, to a computer, and the output would be the label, the segmentation. The way in which we're inverting this is using machine learning. So we're taking the data, which is the image in this case, and we're providing with the data a label. So we're saying these pixels are overwash, these pixels are not overwash. Or in this case, for what we're talking about right now, this picture has overwash in it, and this picture does not. So we're giving images and then a yes or a no. That's all we're doing. And then we hand that to the computer. The computer does a bunch of processes over and over and over again and outspits a program. So it's an inverted way of thinking about it. And in that way, we have a program that we can provide data to, and it will provide an output. So in the machine learning world, this is called inference. So we would use the program that comes out of the data plus the label together to be able to make further predictions or inferences. So I'll show you, this is very nascent in terms of how we're beginning to implement this work, but it highlights how we're starting to think about this as a group of geomorphologists dealing with all of this data. So what we're using to be able to do this is a convolutional neural network, which is just a whole bunch of linear algebra and matrices, and all it's doing is handing an image, and we're pushing it through this pipeline, and we're taking filters, which are called convolutions, and we're sweeping it over the three bands of the image, the red image, the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel. And we're sweeping it over, which makes the image smaller. And then we're pooling, which is another reduction. So we're just sweeping over the images and trying to understand what is going on, what we can see in the image. And by passing the data forward and then backward, by passing the data through and then passing the predictions backward, we can iteratively adjust the math that's inside of the network. And the features, in this case washover, are mapped to specific classes. So this is just a big set of optimization routines. And essentially what we're trying to do is pass an image and have it come out the other side and say, is there a washover in the image? So you can see examples are on the top, no, there's no washover. And on the bottom, yeah, of course there's washover in this image. And in the middle is this maybe. So what we output is a 0 to 1 score. So the top would be 0, no washover. The bottom would be 1. Yeah, we see washover for sure. And the middle would be 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, something like that. So we're able to use this network after we've trained it for prediction. Ooh. There we go. So here's an example of what the output of one of those models would look like. So this is from data from Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Michael, and Hurricane Isaias. On the left column, you can see a bunch of NOAA aerial photographs. In the middle column, you can see where in the picture the neural network is focusing on to make the decision that a washover exists. Where in the image is weighted to the point that's showing that, yeah, we see a washover. So the yellow is these places are very important for making a prediction that a washover occurs, and the blue are places where it's not very important. And if you overlay them on top of the middle image is called a GradCam or gradient class activation map for those in the know. if you overlay those two on top of each other, you can see that the neural network is highlighting areas where washover occurs. So we're starting to get a better understanding of how we can program a computer to be able to do this work for us and find these deposits so that eventually we can cut them out and do some analysis. And on the left, you can see that this is just some statistics that show that it's working well. It's predicting 5 or 6 images wrong out of 70 for each class of washover versus no washover. So the network, even with 1,000 training images, is able to learn this quite well. Now we can develop this. We develop this routine, and we can push the 134,000 images from TenStorms through this process. And that's what we're in the process of doing right now, having a high throughput way of getting this imagery to be predicted if it sees a washover or not. After that, once we've done it for all the different images, we can overlay this. And remember, washover is a spatial process. It's something that has spatial information to it. The lobes appear in certain patterns relative to washover deposits. So we can overlay this and sort of investigate it spatially to understand if there are places where washover is more likely to occur or less likely to occur, and what other spatial relationships are there. So we're on the left, you can see an image of this deployed website where we're using a bunch of different data sources. This is Florence, so you can see the hurricane track, the best track from Florence, the USGS impact predictions, things like that. And you can zoom in and look at a local area and then actually get to the NOAA image. So this is a way that we're trying to enrich the predictions by being able to look at them and investigate them more clearly. And I'll send it back to Eli. I think, yeah, that's what I want to say.
So there are incredible, these images capture really incredible post-event image, just scenes of what the coastal barrier looks like immediately after a storm event. And so bottom right, this was a famous photograph that was published in the New York Times of sort of the super house in Mexico Beach, Florida, after Hurricane Michael in 2018. And you could see, you know, that actually the immediate neighbor behind this house is still standing, and then almost everything else in Mexico Beach, way back to the tree line, as this was raised in this particular case. And so these sorts of immediate post-storm images, and these are what are captured in the images that Evan's just been talking about. These are the ones that often prompt, and the rhetoric is strong at the moment under the current pandemic. But these are, you know, the rhetoric you hear a lot is building back better. And this has been like the disaster risk reduction mantra of the past several years. And what's really interesting is that if you start looking at exactly how building back, you know, what building back looks like, not just sort of immediately after, but many, many, many years later, instead of building back bigger, one of the things that building back better, what we actually found was something that surprised us. So if Evan would advance what we actually found was this phenomenon that we described as building back bigger. And all we did, again, this was a clicking exercise, but and this is something that can be fed into sort of machine learning analysis, but we essentially took the same houses in one image, an early image and a later image, and we digitized them twice. We just traced their physical two-dimensional footprints, and we calculated how big they were. So we started with an image that was just before, the earliest image we could get just before a storm event. And then we got the next image many years later before another hurricane impact. And we took that whole span of time. So in this case, this is a plot for Manahawkin, New Jersey. And anything that plots on the one-to-one line didn't change. Anything that was on sort of the bottom axis there was present in the first image, but absent from the second. So those are houses that effectively disappeared. And then anything that is stuck on the vertical axis is present in the later image, but that's a new build. It was absent from the first image. And what surprised us was this area in the sort of the upper triangle above the 1-to-1 line. And those are all buildings that came back in this direct storm corridor that came back with larger footprints. And it wasn't just in New Jersey. When we widened out the search, you can actually see the same phenomenon repeated. These are, so here we, since we're talking about this in the States, we have 5 different states. We have a range of different hurricanes. None of these places really, in sort of local planning terms, they have nothing to do with each other. They're all subject to different local planning laws, local ordinances. They are all on barriers. They're all in FEMA flood risk, high flood risk zones. So they're united in certain physical ways in terms of the characteristics of what they're built on, but in terms of like planning and the way the built infrastructure of these places is concerned, they are unrelated to each other. And this was something that we were surprised to find this phenomenon manifest in such a strong way. So where that leaves us is essentially we're interested, moving from these scaling relationships in built and unbuilt settings. We're interested in this interaction between sort of active geomorphic processes in built environments and how they compare to their sort of unbuilt counterparts. We're looking for ways to, in this modern era of data, just this data generation. Evan may be the only person on Earth who is actively looking at the entire NOAA catalog, but he's got to do it in an automated way because there are so many, and there are more images to come. Within that sort of data sift, we're starting to see these phenomena like Build Back Bigger that surprise us and tell us maybe counterintuitive things about the way risk profiles change over time, having to do with storm impacts here. And what's exciting, particularly exciting about this whole raft of work is that is the reading we've been doing, the conversations that then kick off with lots of other disciplines, because these are sort of, on the face of it, they look like a geomorphic problem because that's the way we approach them. But the conversation that comes out is with people from all manner of different disciplines. So thank you for listening. And we need to turn it over to Catherine.
Thank you both. Really outstanding presentation. And let me remind everyone to send their questions in the chat to me. We're a little constrained on question and answer time, but we do have time for some. I see Catherine has a question, so I'm going to turn it over to her for a question. I have some as well. So go ahead, Catherine, and in the meantime, others chat me your questions.
Yeah, so my question is somebody who's labeled some of these images for you and for the broader group. There were a lot more questions, more than just, is there a washover, is there not washover? And I was wondering if you could talk about that here, since there's people from a large array of disciplines. Is there any other information that you've been able to gather from the convolutional neural nets that might be interesting for other types of scientists?
Yeah, so I worked with some very talented students to build a web interface to be able to label these images. If anybody's interested in labeling images, please reach out. I would love the help and you will be acknowledged. So in this labeling interface, it asks a whole bunch of different questions. The questions are about the existence of marshes in the images, or nitty-gritty questions about the geomorphology, like how high the water looked like it was during the storm event. And I think that the washover question is really just the first thing that we're examining. There are many more questions and answers that people have provided that will eventually run through this more automated technique. We just needed to pick one to start with.
I see Megan has a question. Megan, go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Oops. Not, oh, that was I think that was private to me. Let me get to that one, and I'll just read it to you. So Megan Mullen, who's a political scientist here at Duke, and I think is on the phone or something to connect, asked, one could imagine that the form of built environment influences both the pattern of washover and the human response to washover. Will your methods allow differentiating across different building patterns? What type of patterns are you thinking about? Road density and water infrastructure seem particularly interesting. So lots there. What do y'all think?
Go for it, Eli.
I mean, we've been, yeah, sorry, I was distracted by there's chat and there's all sorts of, I mean, I think we're just at the beginning of the kinds of quantitative insights we can gain here. I mean, one of the things that's really striking about this whole context is that it has been described sort of off in the corner of coastal geomorphology for a long time, qualitatively described. And I think we're just coming into a period when we have access to data for places that we've just never been able to look at in these quantitative ways before. You know, you're always limited to sort of these local analyses because you could just, it was data availability and limited by that. And I think these, you know, the context of this analysis just keeps expanding. That's my sense of it, is that, you know, we were able to see from the air so much more. And the more we can capture and compare to these other records of, you know, tax databases, and as all of these other forms of open data become more open, you know, I think the kinds of questions that we can ask and the kinds of analysis that we can run just keeps opening up. So it's not, you know, it's not limited to the geomorphology, and it's getting tied increasingly to all kinds of socioeconomic metrics that you can think to try and put in a spatial context. I don't know, Evan.
Yeah, I think just specifically the things that we've looked at are like the road density, the street length, the built fraction of the environment, the and other metrics that we can pull out of OpenStreetMap. So those are the ones specifically that we've started to investigate, and we just don't have time to show some of those specific investigations. But just like Eli has said, we just look for more things to regress against, essentially.
So there are a couple other questions in the chat, but we actually do need to move on to Catherine's talk. And if folks have a little bit of time at the end, we can maybe follow up with more questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Catherine to take it away, and same procedure there. Send your questions for Catherine in the chat to me. If you want me to read them, send them as a private chat, but otherwise I will call on you to read your question. Catherine, take it away.
Let me briefly introduce Catherine on the way here. She's got a background in civil and environmental engineering and geophysics, and she is currently a postdoc with the Coastal Environmental Change Lab at UNC Chapel Hill, but is moving this fall. But luckily for us, staying in the area at NC State, where she'll be an assistant professor in the Water Resources and Coastal Engineering group. And the questions that we don't get to today, let's try to hold on to for 2 weeks from today. Take it away, Catherine.
Thanks. And hopefully I can fly through this and we can get to those questions. So as Brad said, my research background really straddles the geosciences and engineering. So I thought it would be interesting to cover the same topic as Evan and Eli, that is storm impacts and development, but from a slightly different perspective. So the perspective of coastal engineers. And before I dig into the talk, I want to acknowledge that I crafted this presentation with help from the coastal engineering team at NC State. and I'm going to be pointing a lot to work from my colleagues, specifically Sabaranthanam Kameshwar at LSU, Jamie Paget at Rice, and then a cool new study out of NC State and the Naval Academy by Liliana Velasquez Montoya and Beth Shadone and Marjorie Overton. Oops. I'd also like to acknowledge that the projects that I'll be discussing today were performed or the data was collected along the ancestral lands of the Croatan, the Hatteras, the Lumbee, and the Roanoke tribes here in North Carolina along the Outer Banks, and in Texas, the Karankawa tribe. So from the same starting point as Evan and Eli, after every coastal storm, we typically look at NOAA aerial imagery as coastal engineers. And we often ask the same questions. For example, Rick Ludick, who's a coastal engineer and gave the Last Disciplines 101, might ask, how well did we predict the threat from water at the coast? Engineers at the US Army Corps of Engineers, or perhaps the USGS, might ask, was there a dune? Do we expect this dune to be eroded or overtopped and produce these patterns of washover based on forecasts, perhaps from Rick's model at Zirk and Swan, or maybe the dune design if it was engineered? And were any structures damaged? Structures including bridges and homes, or infrastructure networks like roads or water distribution systems. How were they damaged? When were they damaged? And can we as coastal engineers make tools to assess the vulnerability of infrastructure to future storms and coastal change? So at the surface, these questions look pretty similar to Evan's and Eli's in that we're really interested in the water levels, the waves, and how water and waves transport sand and make cool patterns. But the language here is distinct. Prediction, threat, design, damages, vulnerability. And that's because as coastal engineers, our interests and often our research questions focus on the challenges posed by constructing at or near the coast. So in a partial tribute to President Biden's $2 trillion plan to rebuild infrastructure and reshape the economy, today I'm going to talk about that last research question, specifically storm impacts to infrastructure, including roads and bridges. And I'm going to share with you some engineering tools that we can use to identify which bridges and roads are vulnerable to storm impacts now and coastal change now, but also perhaps in the future, 10 years down the road, 30 years down the road. And I put question marks here because we have to use predictions of climate change. So inherently, there's some uncertainty in these vulnerability assessments. So starting with Bridges 101, how are they damaged during extreme storms, such as hurricanes? So after every storm or extreme event, groups like STEER, the Structural Extreme Events Reconnaissance Network out of NSF, will go out and they will assess the damages to critical infrastructure, including bridges. So after Hurricane Katrina, my colleague Jamie Paget went out with her collaborators and they surveyed bridges. And they found that most of the bridge damages along highways were attributed to surge and waves. And specifically, the surge causes the deck to become buoyant, which I show here on the lower left, and then waves can displace the deck, making it unseated from its substructure. But bridges can also they're also damaged by wind, by debris like the barge impact on the lower right, by scour and erosion, and electrical systems can be impacted by water inundation. So post-Katrina, the total bridge repair and replacement costs are estimated at $1 billion, which is just massive. And this really motivated Jamie and later her student Kameshwar, or Sabaranthanam Kameshwar, to create a tool that can help quantify the risk of damage to bridges by surge and waves during hurricanes. And structural engineers typically use something called fragility functions to evaluate how risk varies with changes to bridge parameters. So that's what they did. They developed a new fragility function for the risk to bridges by surge and waves. Sorry, okay. I was getting some feedback. So here I'm showing the fragility function that they came up with, which gives the probability, the conditional probability for a given bridge based on the surge, the wave height, and the bridge height. And here Lx is a polynomial, which is a nonlinear combination of predictor variables. So this predictor variables being these right here, and I've shortened it because it's really long and wouldn't fit on the screen. So this fragility function is created specifically for this failure mode by bridge deck unseating. And it's a little complicated how they created it, but in the simplest form, they developed this function using numerical models of bridges subjected to hurricane loads. And what's really cool about this fragility model is we can give a probability or the odds of a bridge failing for a given surge height and wave height during a storm. So here I'm going to share a project that I worked on with Kameshwar and Jamie using these fragility functions and applying them to a suite of bridges along the Texas coast. So here I'm showing the case study region, which surrounds Freeport, Texas. Freeport is a town that houses a lot of petrochemical facilities, but it's also flanked by a barrier island called Follett Island, which is rapidly migrating landward, and it's really low lying. So it's highly vulnerable to storm impacts. And what we wanted to do was look at how vulnerable bridges are in this region, both now to storms and also in the future. So we used AdCirc and SWAN, the model that Rick talked about during the last Disciplines 101, to simulate storms with variable amounts of storm surge. So here I'm going to refer to them as small, medium, large, and extra large storms. And then we evaluated the fragility of these bridges for current conditions, which at the time this paper was 2008 bathymetry, and then for a future morphology in the not too distant future of 2050, where we modified the bathymetry to represent a landward migration of Follett's Island and lowering of the island, and also included some sea level rise, an intermediate projection of sea level rise. So I looked at 25 bridges, or we looked at 25 bridges, but only 6 of those bridges actually failed for the scenarios that we looked at. So on the next slide, I'm going to be showing you the fragility model for just one bridge, and that's Surfside Bridge, the one shown here. And this bridge is the only connection for communities along Follett's Island to the mainland. So it's a key evacuation route. It's really tall, as you can see. That main span does not fail in any of our simulations, but the approach spans, the ramps, and you can sort of see it in the background here, do fail for several of our scenarios. So here's the fragility model. Failure probability is shown in color for a range of significant wave heights on the x-axis and surge heights on the y-axis. I've labeled each of the different storms based on their storm generation potential. And then our current condition, our baseline condition is shown by a star, and then our future scenario is shown by a square when it includes sea level rise. And then we also simulated just the morphology changes alone to parse out their contribution to fragility, and that's shown in the circle. So a feature of this fragility model is that for a small increase in inundation or surge, we see a sharp rise in failure probability. So maybe just zooming into the medium-sized storm and following from star to square, you can see that increase in probability. And what that means is that sea level rise, while really small, seemingly small, only 0.3 meters, increases the fragility by enhancing these wave and surge loads along Surfside Bridge. And we thought this is pretty interesting. The landscape changes, which were significant, only slightly elevated the failure probabilities above the baseline conditions for the year 2050. So just comparing the location of the star to circle along this S-curve. But we did find that landscape changes do impact the accessibility of the bridge, meaning the time inundated both before and after landfall. So based on the trajectory of the storms that we simulated, we oriented the trajectory to create the largest amount of surge along Freeport, such that in the figure I'm showing on the left, which just gives the water surface elevation for a single time step before landfall, we actually see a seaward directed gradient in water levels. And because we lowered the island for this future morphology scenario, we actually saw draining of the back bays prior to landfall and a faster outflow of storm surge, which resulted in bridges that didn't fail to become accessible hours earlier. So that was a cool finding. So to conclude the bridges section, this was a case study. So we were able to supply local recommendations to Texas DOT, specifically to elevate or tie down these ramps. Elevating is really expensive. Tying down may be a possibility, but generally this method is broadly applicable and could be improved for more hazards. And I know Kameshwar is working on that. But what is really missing from this photo is the roadway. So transitioning into roadways, they not only fail by being submerged by water, but they can also fail during storms due to sand in the roadway, or due to pavement damage, or complete destruction when an island is breached. So for the North Carolinians and many others on this call, the image on the background is probably familiar to you. It shows North Carolina Highway 12, which is the only road access to Hatteras Island. And therefore, it's one of the main drivers of tourism in this region, and allows for a lot of vehicles to access during non-tourist season and during tourist season. So I also show this photo because although Evan doesn't really like to click things, he really likes to tweet. And I found or stumbled upon this tweet by Evan asking NCDOT for web camera imagery that shows this view. I thought that was pretty funny. But it's clear that NC12 is vulnerable to storm impacts. And it's incredibly challenging for NCDOT to maintain this roadway. And so much so that they have a Twitter just for this roadway. So the costs to maintain the road are large. In the past 7 years, or between 2010 and 2017, NCDOT spent nearly $27 million on recovery projects along NC12. And that's not including federally funded nourishment projects or retrofits to bridges along this roadway. So now I'm going to highlight a really cool new study out of NC State and the Naval Academy that tries to evaluate or shows a new tool to evaluate roadway vulnerability along NC12, both now and in the future. And while this is another case study application, the method is broadly applicable to other locations. So this new framework to assess roadway vulnerability is focused on morphological indicators of vulnerability. So Liliana Velasquez Montoya, Beth Shadone, Marjorie Overton have been working for years with NCDOT personnel to craft these morphological indicators of vulnerability, and they work to revise the criteria each year. And so right now what the criteria are shown on the figure on the left, and they include an island width threshold, a critical buffer, which refers to the distance from the shoreline to the roadway, and a dune crest elevation above the roadway. And how they came up with these morphological indicators of vulnerability varied for each indicator. So for the critical buffer, they used historical records, and they found that most remedial actions, including road relocation and nourishment, conducted in the past occurred at about 66 meters. Similarly, for island width, the average width of the island in areas, or this corresponds to the average width of islands in areas that were recently breached during storms. And then lastly, the dune crest, the 3-meter threshold above the roadway, was based on numerical modeling. So this dune elevation refers to a dune that has a 50% chance that 45% of its volume would be eroded in a 4-year period. Okay, so these are site-specific indicators of vulnerability. So first, they tasked themselves to look at the historical vulnerability based on these thresholds. And NCDOT has been creating digital elevation maps 4 times per year for about the past decade. So Liliana went back through these digital elevation maps and looked at them in spatial blocks for this 8-year period. And here she's showing either yes or no for each of these blocks along all of NC12 and P Island, whether or not it met the vulnerability criteria. So we have island width, the dune crest, and the critical buffer. And then she made a composite vulnerability assessment, which is simply the sum of all of the individual indicators. So for the composite, red is the most vulnerable, and it means that in this area, all 3 indicators were met. So this is a highly vulnerable section of the road. And for those of you in North Carolina, it's no surprise that the red areas here include the S-curves, which is the image that I showed previously from the NCDOT Twitter. So to look at future vulnerability, what they did was they predicted the shoreline positions 10 years into the future, or projected shoreline positions 10 years into the future, and then only evaluated indicators that were related to the shoreline position. So that is the island width and the critical buffer. And here is their projected or predicted potential vulnerability for the same region. So blue is showing the vulnerable roadways based on the critical buffer indicator. Yellow is vulnerable roadways based on the island width, and red is the areas where the roadway met both vulnerability criteria. And so something that I thought was interesting was these emerging vulnerabilities, like the old sandbag area, where they formerly or historically weren't as vulnerable as some of these other hotspot areas. So again, an application of a really cool technique or new technique for assessing roadway vulnerability. So in sum, what I hope you take away from this Disciplines 101 seminar is that coastal engineers, or a subset of coastal engineers, develop tools to identify the vulnerability both now and potentially in the future of various types of coastal infrastructure. So I talked about roadways and bridges, but there are many scientists or researchers that look at the vulnerability of water distribution networks or homes to storm impacts and coastal change. And I wanted to leave the discussion with this feedback loop, which I think about a lot currently in my role as a coastal geomorphologist, which is how our activities on these short time scales, like maintaining the transportation routes, and how this affects property values, which might result in construction of larger dunes and nourishment and more risk, how this feedback loop may change, and how bridge vulnerability or roadway vulnerability may change with different policy forcing or climate forcing. So it's a multidisciplinary problem. I can't look at this alone. I've been looking to people in this seminar to help with research questions that surround the future of coastal infrastructure. But with that, I will take any questions.
Thanks, Catherine. I see that there was a comment from Reed in the chat. I'm not sure, Reed, if you want to ask a question. I'm going to ask you a question just while I wait for Reed to respond to that. And that's related to this hazard model of the bridge failure and the prospects of investing more in things like the ramp infrastructure. It strikes me that it's, on some level, it would be straightforward to do some benefit cost analysis and say, like, well, on average, this would fail and it would cost this much to do it. But then I guess the question is, and this relates to your last slide, what is the real time horizon for that? Like, should we be thinking about it as like the next storm, the next 10 storms? Should we, when, are we designing these, these interventions for 10 years, for 20 years? Should we be designing for shorter periods of time given what's going on out there? So I wanted to kind of think about that in the context of what you put up in the last slide.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think a larger issue is who pays for retrofits, or when do retrofits occur to coastal infrastructure such as bridges? It's typically after big storms. So departments of transportation may create designs that, such as tie downs, that are meant to decrease the vulnerability of a bridge over 30 years. But how they get money to pay for it is another question. So in terms of 10-year outlook, 20-year outlook, 30-year outlook, it's not, I think it's really a question of who pays for it and when it happens. But there are some roadways like that are key evacuation routes that need to be maintained, and money needs to be allocated to reduce the vulnerability of those bridges and roadways.
I see a question from Simon Top. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks to all you guys for some great talks. I'm curious about kind of the intersection of your work. So, Catherine, I feel like there is a lag oftentimes between academia and kind of cutting edge modeling and then operational implementation on the government side of things. Can you think of ways to kind of apply a cool deep learning CNN type architecture to identify vulnerability and like structural fragility? And then on the flip side for Evan and Eli, like, can you think of ways to expand your work beyond kind of the identifying overwash aspect to really something that would be operationalized for government use that could identify high risk roadways that, should be prioritized, things like that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Evan, do you want to go first? No?
I did.
Oh,
yes.
okay.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, Simon, I think that that's a clear next step for work that Eli and I have pursued.
Yeah, in terms of machine learning applications for roadway or bridge vulnerability is pretty tough, right? Because it's elevation specific. So unless you did some sort of like photogrammetry, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. But with roadways, it could be cool to apply Liliana's modeling framework or her vulnerability framework on a larger scale. not just a P island, but maybe train a neural net to identify some of these indicators like island width, the critical buffer. I think that could be a larger scale implementation of some of this work.
Yeah, that sounds super cool. Thank you guys.
Brad, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. Yeah, it's about the last part of Catherine's presentation with the vulnerability index along the island there, and the variable that isn't in there that I wonder if it would be useful to add is elevation of the road or the island interior. That dune elevation relative to the road is there, and seems like it might not be useful for this study because road elevation is presumably pretty constant along the shoreline, so you wouldn't get much of a signal for that study. But since if all the overwash keeps getting removed over time, the road or island elevation is going to change relative to sea level, thinking farther into the future, some decades into the future. Do you think, and you're not one of the authors on that, but just wondering whether that would be a useful variable to add in studies like this so that we could extend the projections to future conditions.
Yeah, I'm scrolling to see if Liliana is here. She was going to try to make it. So that'd be an interesting question for her. My intuition is that some of that may be captured in that critical buffer, right? The distance from the shoreline to the elevation of the road. But maybe it is a good indicator to look at. It might be one that she already looked at. I know that they have evaluated a series of morphological indicators, but I'll pass that comment along.
Is that critical buffer from the shoreline to the road a horizontal distance?
Yes.
I understood it. So that the sea level rise would affect that, but it would also have the vertical signal that would be an additional issue for both flooding frequency and storm hazard. You know, the lower the island is relative to sea level, the bigger the storm hazards are potentially.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Also groundwater issues like perch water, and that makes sense. Yeah, good idea. I think that there were some cool questions for Evan and Eli too.
Yeah, I was going to go back and maybe, I don't know if Satya is still on, but maybe combine her question with the one that I had. And I think it also is something that I would like to hear Catherine weigh in on. So both of you have done this work that the economists working in this stuff have talked quite a lot about. So, and one of the things it's certainly a very intriguing result. And one of the things that people talk about is sort of exactly what's meant by Build Back Bigger. So in Satya's question, she was really asking, does the Build Back Bigger actually increase the overall development footprint of the area? Or is it that you get some small houses that get built back bigger and then some that don't get built back at all, and maybe some new ones, but on net, it actually shrinks the overall development footprint? So that was Satya's question. And my question was a little bit related, which is, have you done any work to think about this as a natural experiment comparing to areas that didn't get hit? In other words, we know that new housing starts tend to be larger now than they used to be. And we also know that people don't shrink their houses, but they do add on to them. So do we know, like, how much do we know about the effects that you're seeing post-hurricane as really being attributable to the hurricane versus being attributable to broader trends in real estate markets in terms of people adding on to homes, building larger new housing starts from the get-go? And if the house gets wiped away, then it's a new housing start, So those are the kinds of things that we as economists have talked a lot about and would love to think about ways of delving into with the same hypothesis and some of the same techniques. So just tossing that out there. And the reason I think this relates to Catherine's question is also just, how we think about, like, can we broaden outside the coast to try to understand this kind of pattern of human environment interactions that we're describing and understand what is truly driving in the coastal zone versus what is something that might be a more general phenomenon in other places. So lots there. Sorry, long
I
question.
was texting surreptitiously on, on sort of DMs to try and answer people's questions from the chat. It's a great question, and I think what comes out of our analysis of the Build Back Bigger examination was that it's all in there. Like, all of the things that you described are in those data. You have sort of multiple drivers giving you this overall result of more at the coastline. And so it's less, one of the things that as we discussed that work when it was coming together, it was less, and to me, because we're looking over multiple years and it's just between sort of like hurricane hits or like right before hurricane hits, long span of time before the next one sort of resets the window. It's almost less important, to me anyway, to attribute specific changes. I mean, you can do it but you need to sift like the planning documents, and you need to go into the town offices and pull out the moldy filing cabinets, and you got to look at these things in like parcel by parcel detail, I think, to really get that level of narrative out. But more important, in the first order, is really that this phenomenon is even happening in a place that we know just got clobbered by a hurricane. And so when you take it out of the time scale of the hurricane event and what's directly attributable to sort of reaction to a hurricane, and you broaden that sense of what you think about in terms of the reconstruction time scale, and it gets really sort of diffuse and attenuated. Later on, that you're still in a hurricane zone, even if you haven't had a hurricane in a long time. And North Carolina Outer Banks are an interesting example of that, because direct hits are less frequent than they are in, say, Florida Panhandle.
Catherine, I gave you the more vague question, but did you want to weigh in on this before we close out? We're running out of time here.
I support Eli's response, but happy to talk more offline.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us. I think we'll formally close the session here. We're right at time. And we, again, just a reminder, we have one more this semester in 2 weeks, as Brad was pointing out at the beginning, with Kathy Dello from the State Climate Office, and then much more time for integrative discussion. And those questions will be posted on the Seacoast website. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.